Well, I will start with a little intro to Columbia College Women while we're still waiting for some folks to join the room. Welcome everyone to What's Your Street Race? This is a reunion event organized by Columbia College Women. And the mission of Columbia College Women is to connect alumni to the college, to one another, and to women at large at Columbia University, providing enriching experiences and benefits that support alumni throughout their lives in both personal and professional endeavors, and to create an engaged and dynamic community that strengthens the voices and leadership of women at Columbia University. And if you're familiar with CCW and have been engaged, welcome back. And if you're new to CCW events, I encourage you to keep checking the website or maybe join Facebook and continue to be engaged in the future. My name is Dr. Laurel Daniels Abrazizi. I am a Columbia College class of 1991. I'm an associate professor at the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons in Columbia's programs in physical therapy. And in addition to being on the CCW board of directors, I'm also one of the co-chairs of the 1991 Reunion Programming Committee. So it's particularly exciting for me in a reunion year to have two of my classmates on the panel tonight. So I'm happy to introduce our panelists for this evening. We have three impressive Columbia grads. Nancy Lopez, CC91, is the director and co-founder for the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice and professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. You want to say hi, Nancy? Just quick hi so they see your face.
Saludos familia, greetings family, it's nice to see everyone.
And then we also have Dr. Shelley Eversley, CC91, interim chair, Black and Latinx Studies at CUNY Baruch, academic director and transformative learning in the humanities, also CUNY. Say hi, Shelley, so we all see your face.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here.
And then last but not least, we have Taisha Chavis, CC08 and TC18, who is a doctoral student at TC studying organizational leadership and director of school improvement for NYC Department of Education, educational equity and inclusion strategist. Taisha, say hello.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much, Laurel, for having me.
Great. So each of the panelists will tell you a little bit more about themselves and their work in just a moment. But before we begin, I just want to welcome you all again and want you to know that the panel intentionally chose this Zoom format so that we could engage with the audience and see your faces and hear your questions. They'll each talk for about 10 minutes each to tell you about their work as it interfaces with race and gender and our topics tonight around race and intersectionality. But what we're really interested in is the dialogue, the exchange with the participants, and to hear your questions and to give them a chance to talk with you, not just talk to you. So think back to your own Columbia days and how race or gender impacted your experience and what you've learned since then. And today is just another day to build on that and go deeper and engage with some fellow alums. So without further ado, I'm going to get the conversation started with a question to my classmate, Nancy Lopez. So Nancy, today's talk is called What's Your Street Race? And that really began with you, with your work. And I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about what that means and why that's important, and a little bit more about what you've been doing regarding street race.
Thank you, Laurel, for inviting and for organizing this panel. That's a great question, and I am going to have some audience participation in this conversation. So I'll start off by saying that in the wake of the racial justice movements, we hear a lot of talk about racial justice and BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous people of color, but this really brings up the question of what we mean when we talk about race. So in the chat, I invite you to think of or write one word that best describes how you think about race. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just an invitation for you to have a dialogue about what you think race is. Is it genes? Is it ancestry? Is it origin? Is it ethnicity? Is it nationality? Is it culture? Is it a social status? Is it language? Is it a figment of our imagination? It doesn't exist, or is it something else? So although I'm not able to see the chat, I know that I'll have access afterwards. It's just fascinating to have a reflection on what we mean when we think about race. And then also in the chat, I want you to answer the following question. What's your street race? If you were walking down the street, what race do you think strangers would automatically assume you are based on what you look like? For example, would you be seen as BIPOC, as Black or brown, Asian, Native American, or as white, or maybe something else? If you could also write that in the chat, that would be wonderful for our dialogue. That street race question really emerged out of many conversations and conferences, research published in the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity and Critical Public Health that used this measure that I created called street race. Much of this work transpired out of the work that I do as co-founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. And it came out of community dialogue, and it was really trying to get people to understand, broader publics, what we mean when we talk about race. The beauty of this question is that it aims to be accessible and invite critical reflection on the part of anyone who answers it. It also challenges the myth of race as biology, as race as genetic ancestry, ethnicity, nationality, and culture, and instead focuses on race as a master social status that, just like gender, in most social circumstances, shapes your treatment across a variety of social institutions and interactions. It's also an invitation for us to think about the multiple dimensions of race for measurement and institutional data. A wonderful TEDx talk I recommend and publications come from Dr. Kamara Jones, The Gardener's Tale, where she talks about the levels of racism, and also a 3-part video series called Race, the Power of an Illusion. If race is not just about your personal identity, but it's also about how others ascribe social meanings to your physical appearance, whether that's your skin color, your hair texture, and facial features, how that relates to grids of power, then what does that mean for institutional data collection meant to rectify that inequity? If we wouldn't collect gender and sexuality in one question, or parental educational attainment and income in one question, then should we collect race and ethnic origin or ancestral origin in one question? I would argue no, and this is part, again, of my involvement in trying to get the census to create meaningful data that helps us map injustice and rectify that. It's always important, I argue, to include at least 2 questions when asking about race. How do you self-identify? Here you can mark all that apply, and I think that's very important. I'm a Black Latina, Dominican woman born and raised in the United States, an upward bound career beginnings baby, double discovery baby, and also a class of 91 here at Columbia. So you can mark everything that you want there. But that second question, what's your street race? And here I ask that you mark only one box when asked about your street race. Think about President Obama, the son of a Black immigrant man from Kenya and a white US-born woman from Kansas. He marked only one box for the 2010 census. And the civil rights use of that data. Ask yourself, if President Obama were walking down the street for an apartment, applying for a mortgage, or if he showed up in an ER with symptoms of appendicitis, would anyone think he's white? There's multiple studies that show this across multiple disciplines that, for instance, the Urban Institute did a study in 28 cities with 8,000 testers and found that, of course, when people showed up and they were visible minorities, this is when the housing discrimination occurred. The census claims that the Latinos have a hard time answering the race question because 40% check other and write in, their nationality, but a deep dive tells a different story. 85% of Cubans identify as white compared to Dominicans, only 30% of them identify as white. and for South Americans, it's about 66%. So the current gaps in demographic data collection have led some academics to believe that it would be better to include Hispanic as a racial category in our official data collection than collecting Hispanic origin as a separate question from race. Despite these good intentions, that approach is flawed. It's not based on the preponderance of scientific evidence on social inequalities. It is vital that we use intersectionality for inquiry and praxis, for rigorous metrics that outline injustices in order to rectify them. So if we ask someone if they are Hispanic and they say, yeah, I'm Latino, I'm Cuban, I'm Puerto Rican or Colombian, and stop there, we may miss an opportunity to find out if someone who identifies as Hispanic origin and is light skinned is treated differently than their own brothers and sisters or cousins or spouses who may be seen as Black and brown bodies when they walk down the street. Think about David Ortiz, think about Ricky Martin, think about George Lopez. And if they all went looking for an apartment in the same, what the research evidence says, right? So in the chat, I invite you to write one word that comes to mind when you hear the word intersectionality. What does that mean to you? I know that's a word that's used a lot. And then another question I want you to think about is what word or image comes to mind when you hear the word solidarity, right? I hope the street race question can create critical reflection on our relational positions and grids of power. I hope the street race question contributes to cultivating understanding, unity, and solidarity for human rights. Sociologists Baca Zinn and Zambrana make it plain, and I quote, "We caution that Latino, Latina as a social construct must be problematized, that it's complicated by differences in national origin, citizenship, race, class, ethnicity, and by the confluence of those factors. An intersectional approach acknowledges these differences and seeks to reveal and understand how they shape experience. When we use the term Latinas, it's not as a unitary term that homogenizes distinctive groups, but as a term of implicit solidarity with other US groups with the Spanish colonial history, genealogical, political, cultural, and ethnic ties to Latin America," end quote. An unsolicited email shows how one woman reflected, and she says, quote, "As someone whose street race is white, but has a grandmother who immigrated from Latin America, it made me think a lot about my own journey in understanding my relationship to race and ethnicity. It's something that I'm beginning to grapple with and has caused a fair amount of discomfort as well as excitement. I was wondering if you had any book recommendations for someone who's just beginning to explore these issues in her own life." I think that's a beautiful quote because it practices critical reflection, right? And embraces that discomfort that might come from that critical reflection. To conclude, I invite you to consider how you would practice solidarity with your cousins, siblings, and other loved ones, your neighbors, your friends, who may be racialized very differently from you based on what they look like. What two things can you do to advance racial and intersectional justice and human rights, not only for ourselves, but also for our children, our families, communities, for generations to come? Feel free to share your ideas in the chat, and I'll end here. But do think about what one or two things you can do to advance racial and intersectional justice. And check out our website for the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice, race.unm.edu. You'll find more videos than you want to watch, but there's a lot of resources there. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Nancy. The two words towards the end of your talk that resonated for me were that discomfort and excitement, because I think for many people, talking about race is not comfortable. It may be very new to many people to even be starting to think about what their street race is and what that means in terms of their positionality. But I think pushing out of that comfort zone is where we grow. I think we can build on the whole intersectionality concept. And with that, I will now introduce my classmate, Dr. Shelley Eversley. Your academic and scholarly work addresses both race and gender. I'm hoping you can build on this conversation and talk a little bit more about the intersection of critical race theory and gender and class and sexuality, and what would you hope that any Columbia student or alum learns or understands about intersectionality in 10 minutes, but do your best, like highlight reel.
All right, cool. Hi, thank you, Laurel and Nancy. Thank you for that opening on street race. I just wanted to follow Nancy's point that race and ethnicity are not the same. In a color conscious country like ours, like the United States, street race is how a person's skin, hair, phenotype reads in public, and it does affect their position in America's racial caste system. So in other words, colorblindness is not anti-racism. You can't say, it's hard to say, oh, I don't see color, and think that because you don't want to see color that it doesn't exist and it doesn't feed certain kinds of racist structures and behaviors. Thinking about Nancy's term, relational positionality on grids of power, where you stand on a grid of power can indeed inspire unity and solidarity in the very noble cause of human rights and racial justice. And I'm just gonna believe that everyone in the Zoom room believes in racial justice and believes in human rights, however differently that might be. But this is maybe, I'm hoping, the reason why we've all come together today. And because we're thinkers, arguably with the best education in the world, I see our thinking about how racism works as an opportunity to effect change in our various spheres of influence. Thought inspires action. Americans like Frederick Douglass, Grace Lee Boggs, James Baldwin, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Audre Lorde have been articulating and advocating for intersectional thought and action long before the term intersectionality appeared as a key word in what is now known as critical race theory. I'll drop in the chat some background reading and some references about anti-racism, about intersectionality, some early examples, and then also maybe an innovative example. But for now, I'll say that critical race theory was born out of critical legal studies, and it extends across academic disciplines to invite more complex thinking about how race and racism works. Basically, it examines the concept of race as a social construct. For our purposes tonight, we can think about the concept of race much like the way Nancy is describing street race. How does race get articulated as a social value, interwoven within the many and varied experiences of American life? Critical race theory follows the Frankfurt School of Philosophical Thought because it explores how power and how privilege manifest in everyday life. Intersectionality in critical race theory asks us to think about the ways in which intersecting color, class, gender, and or sexual identities, for instance, inform a person's social or political experience. Intersectionality asks us to think more complexly. It asks us to think beyond binaries like black and white. It asks us to think beyond binaries like gay and straight. And instead, with intersectional inquiry, we are able to think about the ways in which skin color, for instance, overlaps with gender identity, while at the same time it intersects with class status, so that the upper middle class white girl in America can grow up without fear that a routine traffic stop will not end in violence. And because she is white, she is 3 times less likely to be raped in her lifetime. Mind you, in America, 20% of all women will be raped in their lifetimes. That percentage goes up if the woman is Black, brown, transgender, or undocumented. Intersecting nodes of politics, gender, race, sexuality, and class create this culture of violence against women, and it creates stratospheres or hierarchies of how women will experience that violence. Intersectionality creates room for us to recognize the multiple factors that not only inform experience, but also how they shape relations to power. What I can appreciate about intersectionality is that it invites critical thinking and structural problem solving in the service of emancipatory change. It inspires alternative mindsets. And here, this is the part where I want us to kind of try to imagine innovation in critical race theory and innovation in thinking and acting with an intersectional mindset. It invites us for a new kind of design thinking for those of you who are interested in management, right? Design thinking that can offer meaningful solutions to racism's problems. If our thinking informs our actions, imagine if we changed how we think about the problems that affect us all. And this is what intersectionality does, right? It helps us see the ways in which we're all connected. It helps us see the ways in which multiple forces overlap and intersect in our experiences. If we can see and change our mindset and see those connections, we have the opportunity to recognize the way that income and health inequality, gender and sexual violence, educational opportunities, climate change even, are intersectional when we talk about race, racism, gender, class, ethnic identity. And we can together change the world. If we change our minds, if we change, when I say our minds, when we change the way we approach a problem, whether it's systems thinking, whether it's design thinking, or intersectional thinking, and apply that kind of rigor to how we think about racism and its multiple problems and its multiple overlapping issues and concerns, I do believe we can change the world. And so when I think about us all here together because of our connection to Columbia University, to Columbia College, I think about the ways in which we are already trained to think complexly. We already know how to appreciate music inside of a historical context. We know how to talk about economic shifts in the context of political changes, in the context of political histories. Why can't we also then invest some time and energy in thinking about the ways in which racism is intersectional? It has political dimensions, it has economic dimensions, it has class, gender, sexuality dimensions, it has ethnic dimensions, it has nationality dimensions, and all of those dimensions come together. So because we already know how to think complexly, why don't we think complexly about the way racism works so that we can undo it? I'm just going to end there, and I'm going to drop some sources and resources in the chat, and I look forward to our conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Golly gee, I'm a glass half full person, so when you delve into the complexity of the problems, but what really comes out is that, again, excitement about the complexity that's needed to solve the problems, and that we are able, if we commit to it, think in complex ways to really be able to tackle this and not shy away from it. That your words are very inspirational, Shelley. Thank you. Thank you. Taisha, now on to you, budding professor, joining the crew. I want you to share with our audience now how these themes, critical race theory, intersectionality, are reflected in your role and path and the work that you've been doing in New York City schools, and maybe end with your thoughts on, how regular citizens, because I know you've focused on younger school students. How can people who haven't really dedicated their careers to this work have the greatest impact? Where do you see your career going in terms of making a dent in this?
Right. Thank you for the question, Nancy, and thanks again for coordinating the event. To my co-panelists, Nancy and Shelley, thank you so much for your critical contributions and really an academic lens around critical race theory and intersectionality. What I would like to offer is a more practical kind of and what it looks like in practice. And so through my own professional experience, I would begin with kind of what brought me to education and recognizing the level of racial disparities that existed in education. And so, I had very privileged educational experiences, and a lot of my neighborhood peers growing up in Harlem didn't have access, right, and opportunities, the same kinds of access and opportunities as I had. And so I decided that I would, go into teaching. And I began as a special education teacher. I recognized that the majority of my students were being referred to, who were being referred to special class, were Black boys, disproportionately so. And while of course I could advocate for my students, I felt like my platform wasn't large enough because I was also seeing Black girls who were disproportionately suspended and expelled, not because they were, more likely to exude or display, undesirable behaviors, but because they were vocal, right? And that there were clear policies that were unfair and punitive to Black girls' hair, right? The way that they wore their hair, the way that they chose to wear, hair coverings, and how they were vocal again to a lot of teachers, and teachers who were not culturally responsive or didn't know how to respond. And so, I would definitely recommend Push Out by Monique Morris. It's an amazing text. She looks at the criminalization of Black girls, and, says that Black girls, are 7 times more likely to be suspended from schools, than their peers, right? Either white girls or, white boys or Black boys. And so just thinking about the level of need there, I've devoted a lot of my work in education around reducing some of those harmful disparities against Black girls and Black boys. And so a lot of my work centers, equity and inclusion, and, adult learning and development, coaching and supporting adults with recognizing unconscious biases that happen in the classroom, and racist ideologies, confronting that head on. And so, the second part of your question, Laurel, that I absolutely love is like, for folks who, aren't as involved in racial equity work, what can they do to dismantle racism and systems of oppression? It really starts, kind of within your sphere of influence and working on self, right? I think that Nancy kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. Really investigating what you were taught implicitly and explicitly around race and racism. What racial identities do you hold, right? What social identities do you hold, and what were you taught about those identities? And within the context of your work, how does this impact your relationship with students, with children? If you do work with children. And so, I'm thinking of Professor Yolanda Celia Ruiz at Teachers College, who coins it as the archaeology of self, right? Really kind of the digging deep and investigating, all of these messages that we've internalized since birth, really around race and racism. And then I think the next part of that, what I would suggest is really becoming like comfortable with discomfort, right? So like when you're engaging in race-based conversations with friends, family, colleagues, right? These courageous conversations are necessary. Otherwise, we're just holding racism in place. And so I also recommend like Glenn Singleton's text. It's a really great place to start in terms of, engaging in race-based conversations. And then finally, like for me, I would, definitely consider moving beyond allyship, right? Bettina Love frames this as, being a co-conspirator. And we hear Angela Davis talk about, being an anti-racist. It's, speaking up when you hear or see acts of discrimination and acts of racism take place. Really leveraging and using your voice and your privilege to defend Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I think those are kind of like 3 practical, approaches, that anyone could use and take, to begin to dismantling systemic oppression within their sphere of influence.
Fabulous. Thank you. My eyes twinkled a little bit when you mentioned Push Out. That was actually a Columbia College Women signature event last year. We had her and talked about her book. It was wonderful. I do recommend it to folks who are growing and trying to learn more. The 3 of you have really laid some groundwork for some critical conversations. I hope that we can spend the second half of the talk entertaining questions from the audience. I want to thank you for sharing your stories and your thoughtful insights on race and gender. I know I've been navigating conversations about race my entire life, and those conversations will differ depending on whether I'm talking to my kids or talking to my neighbor mom friends or my students or my faculty colleagues. So I was really curious about what would unfold in this Zoom setting with alums with, you know, a range of generations and races. And I want to get in as many questions as possible from the audience before asking more of my own questions. So we're going to use the chat, or you can raise your hand. I'm going to try to navigate both of those platforms at the same time, but we've intentionally left a lot of time so that we could get to as many questions as possible. Are there any questions from the audience for any of our panelists? If you'd like to ask it yourself, you can use the little reaction tool at the bottom of the Zoom and raise your hand. And I will try to find you on the participants list. I think you go to the top of my list if you raise your hand. And if that doesn't work, feel free to enter a question into the chat box. Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, Amy. All right, so
Okay,
there,
I won't be
unmute.
too shy. I figured I'll start it off. You know, the thing that I sort of struggle with when I speak to other people is that this cult of meritocracy in America, I think, can be very destructive when you talk about, you know, intersectionality and race. And by that, I mean, you know, I'm an immigrant myself. And if I speak to folks who are sort of older, they very much feel that, look, you know, you can just get on with it, right? And especially as sort of coming from an Asian family, where I don't think that growing up, I, you know, certainly had issues around race, but you know, I'm not going to say that I had a similar experience if, you know, of my, you know, Black friends, right? So when I speak to other people, they very much don't see, you know, they don't see this, the racial aspect of it, and do very much feel that, you know, America as a society is meritocracy, and so all you have to do is work really hard. And I find that that's the most challenging discussion that I have, and it gets me really riled up. And, you know, I just don't have really a good way of talking around that. So I would love to, you know, to kind of see what you guys think about that. Sorry, I know it came out.
Yeah.
You know, I hope you can feel like it just gets me so frustrated that I can't really even articulate it very well.
Can I respond? I'm responding partly because, you know, you know, the famous, you know, statement of double consciousness where you live in two worlds. Well, you know, I'm in New York City and I work at the opposite of Columbia in the same island of Manhattan. I work at Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York system. And I was talking to one of my students the other day. He was turning in his final essay of his college career. And I was talking to him, and he's Chinese American. And he got a job at a bank, and it's amazing. And, you know, of course, I was hoping that he'd be the poet, pursue the poetry, but he needs that job at the bank. And what's really interesting is he said, you know, all this time, you know, I've been studying and working and studying, and the best place I have to study is in the factory where my parents work. And I said to him, where's the factory? And he said, it's in Chinatown. And I said, is that a sweatshop? And he's like, we just call it a factory. And I think about what that my student has done. And it's not meritocracy. He has his entire community is, you know, standing behind him, rooting him on. And I know, because he's my student, I know that he didn't have access always to the internet. And I know that very often he came to class with his phone using the free internet at the public library. And I know that if that kid had any of the resources that we got at Columbia, he'd be even farther along in his life and his career and his ambition. And I think that, Amy, that one of the answers that you can do, I don't know what you do and how people in your life respond to you. Some people like a story, and I tell stories like that story of my student. You know, I have to keep a straight face. I'm on camera and they're off camera, and he's off camera because he's standing outside the library in the rain with his phone in a Zoom class. And still he managed to produce enough work to not only graduate from a public college, but also to land a job at a fancy bank while studying at a sweatshop in Chinatown. That's a story that resonates for me. And some people they need to hear those stories because they want to imagine that every Asian American, every Asian person is somehow some born natural super achiever, when in fact there's labor involved in everyone's success. And there's also data. And, you know, as an Asian American person, or thinking about especially the renewed violence and anti-Asian hate that seems to be, you know, gaining even more traction in the face of all of these anti-racist movements happening in the United States right now. You know, the data shows that more Asian American people are working class and broke than these super high achievers, that, you know, somehow their success is an example that somehow erases all of the other intersecting moments that limit a person's potential. And so I think that one answer you could do is just have your data on hand, you know, have a couple of good stats, and then have the story that's real. Because some of us need stories, and then we can back it up with the data. And I think that might help. And of course, telling those stories. And I think that now is a time that we all have to come together in unity. I see this in the chat. We have to come together in unity and see the ways in which racism isn't, again, a binary issue, and it isn't easily recognized in terms of the old-fashioned ways of thinking. And old-fashioned ways of thinking aren't going to solve these very sophisticated systems of racism and oppression. If that helps, Amy.
Thank you. We have another question. Lian Chung?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, and I apologize, my camera isn't working. Shelley, thank you for sharing your lovely, lovely story. I am Asian. I was born behind Columbia at St. Luke's Hospital. I'm older than the panelists because I was in 88, back when New York City was pretty seedy. I live in sunny Sarasota, Florida. I'm so excited going up to New York City because I miss everything about New York City. So I'm going up on Friday, going up there for a week, but I've never been this anxious and scared of all this anti-Asian crime. I've been forewarned so many times in the last year, don't go up to New York, not because of the pandemic, but because of the anti-Asian. I literally bought pepper gel. I have spent a day and a half trying to figure out how to travel with pepper gel. I have friends who are Caucasians who've told me, coached me how to not look Asian in the next week, hide my hair, wear sunglasses. You all are going to laugh. I have not had my hair cut in Chinatown in a year and a half. So my hair is down to my belly button. I never had such long hair, even in high school or even at Columbia. I am just wondering, and I'm in my 50s, so I shouldn't even have hair that long. So I'm literally coached by my white friends on how to disguise my Asianness. Meanwhile, this last half year, I've had tremendous support from African-American friends who've reached out to me by saying, oh, Leanne, if there's anything I can do for you. If they've been very supportive. I thought that was interesting. But I literally have been coached and advised in the next week not to go around places by myself. I walk everywhere by myself in Manhattan. I take the subways, but I've been encouraged not to take the subway because I'm Asian. Do you all have any insight for me? I think I've kind of pretty street smart. I probably will ride the subway, but I've never been this anxious because of being and looking Asian.
I was just going to jump in and thank you for, and I'm so sorry that you're going through this. This is horrible. And I think about, how many other instances of human rights violations are happening based on what you look like, based on your street race. But I think the other dimension to think about is how gendered this violence is, right? It's overwhelmingly, it seems that it's directed towards women, right? Women who are street race Asian, and there's a particular street race, right, that are being
right.
targeted.
And I literally am going to travel with a knife and pepper gel next week. I haven't even opened up this pepper gel, and I've never traveled with a knife.
So it really begs the question of how is it that we can practice flexible solidarity? This is what Patricia Hill Collins writes about in her most recent book, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. Anne-Marie Hancock writes about deep political intersectionality. And of course, Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, but clearly there's been many other contributors to this thought, talks about political intersectionality. So what does this mean? What Liang Chung is going through right now, along with so many others. If I'm here in New Mexico, and you can imagine during COVID, it was people who were street race native that were being violently attacked because they had COVID, right? Because the cases, the number of cases of Native American people with COVID was higher, disproportionately higher. So how do we use this horrible these human rights violations to think about how we create coalitions, movements that are about international solidarity, practicing what we preach, whether it is someone who's being attacked for looking Asian or Asian woman, or Dene, Navajo, Native American, or even on the border for being brown, right? So this is an opportunity for us to think about, and of course, the violence that has been visited, right, on Black bodies since this country was started. So thinking about ways that we can work collectively to make this visible, to intervene, and to practice that intersectional solidarity. I think about transgender Black women in particular, who are also subjected to violence on the street. So I think this is a moment for reflection and action. And hopefully, you know that a lot of the state legislatures are banning any curriculum in K-12 that talks about structural racism, the history of slavery in our country, the enslavement of African Americans, indigenous people, the internment of Japanese, et cetera. We do need to make sure that we are working to make sure this doesn't continue to happen. The erasure, colorblind racism, and again, the accompanying intersectional violence. So I don't know what the solution is, but again, thinking about how we can work towards this flexible solidarity. What does that mean?
So Nancy, thank you. And pero puedo hablar español porque soy ingeniera en la construcción. So maybe I should speak Spanish instead of English. So maybe that might be safer on the subway. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's hard to even know how to respond to the fear and anxiety that you're feeling right now. Like it's real fear and it's real anxiety, and it's hard to know what will make you feel more comfortable if it's not that someone can say nothing will ever happen. It's a hard situation to be in, and unfortunately, it's all too common.
Laurel, if I can just kind of dovetail off of Nancy's point around solidarity, for one, Leanne, I definitely appreciate your level of courage, right, and vulnerability, and offering your story and bringing that into this space. And so what I'm thinking in terms of solidarity, I think it really is important to have like a strong village around you, right? Of folks that, like deeply care for you and love you, and are able to, encourage you, and kind of offer this level of strength and support, when thinking about what's safest for you. And granted, like that shouldn't be a conversation, right? It shouldn't be a consideration that you make, do I take the subway or should I Uber it? It definitely should be an option, but I think that having people around you who are going to be supportive and really show up in solidarity, maybe that looks like you also sharing what you need, right, from your friend group and your colleagues, and being very clear about like some of the considerations that you're making around your safety and how you feel alienated, to be able to have a stronger support network around you.
Great advice, Taisha. Thank you. So we have about 10 or 12 more minutes. Do we have any additional questions from the audience?
I was just thinking about intersectionality. This is Leanne's story, and her concerns really raise that specter again. I mean, when you think about the ways in which two women of color, let's say hypothetically, one Asian American woman and an African American woman are lovers, they are thinking about every time they go on vacation, right? Every time they book a hotel or say, oh, I really want to go to Jamaica. I love listening to Bob Marley. And then they think, maybe we can't go to Jamaica because we can't be safe. This idea that you're feeling this for the first time is extraordinary in another very sad way, that so many people experience this when they book a trip in a bourgeois way. They experience this when they are imagining how they'll raise their children or where they'll raise their children. They're thinking about this when they think about their interracial relationship, where they will live, where they will travel, how they will travel. They think about this when they are going to find an apartment. They think about this when they take a job, because some things we can't hide, right? You can't hide your street race. Maybe you can wear glasses and you can maybe not be noticed, but maybe you can't. And there's no hiding from the danger that faces you because of the intersectional racist inspired violence. And that's a moment where, again, we can come together. And this is the moment where I prefer, like you, Laurel, I prefer to think about this in an optimistic way, because together we can change the world. And this is one of those things where people say, oh, Shelley, you're so naive. I'm a grown woman who's been through enough to know that it only took one person. When Fannie Lou Hamer was being hunted and chased and assaulted just so she could exercise her rights to vote, and she defied them all. She says, they kill me, I will be 5'3" feet closer to freedom. And this is one of those moments when, I hold on to that. And I think about all the ways that we actually, just the small acts, also reference to Bob Marley, the small acts make a difference. They add up. And so, that's something that I think is worth taking home with us as this night winds down.
And I'd like to think too, thank you, Shelley, that just us all being present to hear the story has changed each and every one of us, right? And that's another story we will be able to share to make this a reality for someone who doesn't see it. Oh, I see a couple more hands now. I see my classmate, Christopher, and then Margaret. How about you first, Christopher? Are you there, Christopher? How about we come back to you and we'll take Margaret's question?
I was just, Shelley, I was just going to remark on what you're saying. I mean, my street race is white. And And so when I think about that, and as I've been listening, we all make assumptions about people, literally as we're walking down the street and seeing each other. And I happen to live here in New York City. So I was just trying to think about maybe advice that we have to try to break whatever the assumptions are. What are the things we can do? I know that what I'm finding is that New York, you kind of, politeness in New York is not bothering other people, not talking to other people on the street usually, right? But I find these days, because of the pandemic, because people are wearing masks, we're interacting with each other more. And people are saying hello to me on the street, I'm saying hello to them. And I think that helps to kind of set the tone that we're all in this together from a pandemic perspective, from a, sort of a lot of the racism that's happening perspective. But I don't know if you have suggestions or things you can do to sort of be proactive about, your interest in not sort of assuming stereotypes, et cetera.
Any comments from the panel?
So I think the first thing that we can think about is that when we critically reflect on our street race, we can kind of see what our positionality is in grids of power, right? In terms of in that interaction when you are applying for a mortgage, or maybe you're in a hospital setting, or maybe you're interfacing with law enforcement. Being aware of that means that you can intervene if you see an injustice, or if you are able to change the conversation. If you see a macroaggression happening, a microaggression happening, how can you not be a bystander, be an upstander, right? So those are the kinds of things that come to mind. I think about Charles Mills' book, The Racial Contract, where he talks about the role of anti-abolition people racialized as white, who engaged, right, in making sure that they were working towards dismantling white supremacy and structural violence on those who were racialized differently. So thinking about our roles in an intersectional way, we could think about, if I am documented, how am I practicing intersectionality with those who are being dehumanized, placed in cages on the border and different parts of this country? How am I practicing intersectionality with the LGBTQI community, right? Even if I'm not a member of that community, how am I practicing what I preach? So I think there's multiple ways that we can intervene depending on the situation.
Helpful. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think one of the things that that's been pointed out to me is, I've joined some groups that are specifically for people with my background, how we can do a better job versus trying to make it the problem of others to explain it to us, how our privilege, is impacting others and things like that. So there's like showing up for racial justice in some of these other groups I found really helpful in that way.
Thank you. Christopher, are you back? Okay, how about Leonie? And I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly.
No, that's fine. It is Leonie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So as I listened, and I listened to Leanne's comment, I think one of the things that we did when we were younger, when we were in school, we paired up. So and I lived in the Bronx, then came to Columbia. And I think as with the climate that we have going on right now, we talk about being allies and supporters of each other. And I think that's one of the things we need to probably go back to, where if you have a friend and who's coming from out of town, or a friend who's in New York City or wherever, and that person has some concerns, we have to be willing to not just give them advice, but to step up and say, where are you going and you're coming into town? Why don't we make the time to go with you? And I think especially as women, we need to go back to that time where we said, okay, we paired up when we were going to the bathroom. We paired up when we went to summer camp. And that's one of the simple things we need to be. is be allies to each other and be there, not just talk it, but actually walk with that person. That's my comment.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm going to give Christopher one more chance if you're still there. I think the name is gone now.
Yeah, I think he wrote in the chat that he's unable to.
No,
unmute.
she.
Sorry, Christopher. Oh my gosh, I know
Our
who you
classmate.
are. I know. Hi, Christopher.
Unable to unmute.
Oh, no,
Okay.
yeah, sorry. Hi, Christopher.
So one thing I will say, I think we're going to be wrapping up now anyway. It's already 7:58. Today marks the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I have to admit that I did not know about the Tulsa Race Massacre until I watched The Watchmen a couple of years ago and was reading about The Watchmen and realized that the event being portrayed at the beginning of that television show was a real event. I'm ashamed to say that, like, where was I? How did I not know? And then as I've read more, have come to realize that, this wasn't being taught. It's not just that I didn't know, it wasn't being taught. It's kind of actually covered up. And what this has highlighted for me is that as Columbia alums, despite great education, we can't assume that it was all comprehensive and that everything we need to know to act in today's world, we learned with our great education. We learned to be critical thinkers, but particularly with regard to race and social justice, we need to take charge of our own continued learning. And so I'm so glad that our panelists have shared a whole chat room full of resources as places to start. I hope that you all found today thought-provoking and a beginning of a conversation, and will continue to seek out other venues to hear more stories, do more reading, watch more TED Talks and movies and documentaries, and continue to educate yourself and be engaged and be part of this complex solution that we're going to need for these very complex issues. I want to say thank you again to Nancy, to Shelley, and to Taisha. You were phenomenal panelists. It was a pleasure to host this with you guys. And thank you, CCW, and thank you, Sarah, behind the scenes, our Columbia Alumni Office, working magic to help us make this happen. I think that's it. It's 8 o'clock. There's another talk right now, CC91 architecture talk that started 15 minutes ago. So if you want to jump on that, I encourage you to do so. And maybe I'll see you at other reunion events throughout the rest of the week. Thank you again to our panelists. Good night, everyone.